The spaghetti dinner that made the Mafia back down. In a Harlem restaurant, a killer lost an eye, a city found its soul, and a legend ordered pasta. This moment, frozen in the amber of time, is more than a gangland tale. It is a masterclass in psychological warfare, a turning point where perception became the ultimate weapon. This wasn't a simple brawl. This was a declaration, carved into flesh and served on a dinner plate. 36 precise, brutal strikes in a single, terrifying encounter. By the 12th, the man from Chicago was broken. By the 24th, he was blinded, his world reduced to a haze of pain and permanent shadow. And by the 36th, every single person in that room, from the fleeing waiter to the horrified intellectual, understood a new, unbreakable law of the jungle. The story of those cuts would echo through the streets, but it was the calm that followed, the deliberate click of a fork on china, that would truly rewrite the rules of power in New York City. To understand the earthquake, you must first map the fault lines. Summer 1935. Harlem is not just a neighborhood, it is a living, breathing entity, a powder keg of creativity, oppression, and resistance, and everyone is holding a match. The Great Migration has filled its streets with a potent energy, but the Great Depression has left deep scars. In this cauldron, two economies thrive, one visible and one invisible. The most lucrative of all was the numbers racket, an illegal lottery that was the financial lifeblood of the community, a daily ritual where hope was purchased for a penny. On one side stood the powerful, flamboyant, and notoriously volatile Dutch Schultz. Based in the Bronx, Schultz saw Harlem not as a community with its own rulers, but as an unconquered wallet. His empire, built on beer and brutality during Prohibition, was vast, but Harlem's numbers game was the prize he believed was his by right of sheer might. He didn't see partners or people, he saw profit to be extracted, a territory to be colonized by his white gunmen. He had already begun his invasion, sending in forces across the 155th Street Bridge to muscle in on the operations, believing fear alone would be enough to bend Harlem to his will. On the other side stood a man who was the antithesis of Schultz's bluster, Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson. Where Schultz was loud, Bumpy was quiet. Where Schultz ruled through unpredictable terror, Bumpy cultivated an aura of calculating, impeccable control. He was not the founder of Harlem's numbers empire, that was the brilliant Madame Stephanie St. Clair, but he was its undisputed shield. A transplant from Charleston with a sharp mind and a sharper temper, Bumpy had earned his nickname from a physical characteristic, but it came to represent the unpredictable obstacles he placed in front of his enemies. He had made a vow, a sacred promise to his people and his employer. Harlem would remain under its own control. Its wealth would circulate within its streets. Schultz's men kept disappearing on those dark, familiar streets, vanished by Bumpy and his small, loyal crew, who moved like ghosts in a city they knew intimately. Frustrated and humiliated, Schultz decided the solution was not more soldiers, but a single, perfect weapon. He needed a statement written in blood, a public execution that would shatter Harlem's spirit. So he called for a specialist from Chicago, a city where violence was an industrial product. His name was Ulysses Rowlands. He was a monster forged in the slaughterhouses of the Midwest underworld. Standing 62 and 240 pounds of scar tissue and hardened muscle, he was a man who communicated only in the language of force. His reputation was a thing of grim legend. He had killed 11 men before his 25th birthday. In Chicago, they called him the Bull for a reason. Once he charged, he trampled everything in his path until nothing moved. Schultz offered him a king's ransom, $5,000 upfront, $10,000 upon delivery, with one explicit instruction: make it loud, make it public. I want every numbers runner in Harlem to know what happens when they resist. Rowlands accepted. He saw a simple job: find a local tough, erase him, and collect a small fortune. What Schultz, the outsider, and Rowlands, the imported brute, fatally failed to grasp was the fundamental nature of Bumpy's power. In Harlem, Bumpy wasn't just a man, he was an institution. The streets themselves were his nervous system. The shoeshine boys on the corners, the grandmothers in the windows, the fruit vendors on the avenues, they were all his eyes and ears. An intricate web of loyalty, built on respect, fear, and patronage, fed him information. Rowlands arrived on a Tuesday, a strange, hulking figure in a neighborhood that noticed everything. By Thursday, word had slithered through every barbershop and bar. By Friday morning, Bumpy knew everything. He knew Rollins' hotel room number at the Teresa. He knew he'd eaten ham and eggs for breakfast. He knew about the .45 caliber pistol in the shoulder holster and the stiletto in his boot. Most importantly, Bumpy knew Rollins was now hunting him, a predator clumsy in an unfamiliar jungle. And so Bumpy Johnson did something extraordinary. He did not hide. He did not surround himself with an army of bodyguards. He made a reservation. He planned a dinner date, not with a fellow gangster to discuss war, but with Helen Lawson, a sophisticated white senior editor from Vanity Fair magazine. This was a deliberate choice, a multi-layered move in the chess game already underway. Helen represented a world utterly alien to the street, educated at Vassar, a critic of film and theater, a woman fascinated by the Harlem Renaissance as a cultural phenomenon. Her presence served multiple purposes. It projected normalcy, it showcased Bumpy's unique position as a man who moved between worlds, and it created a scenario of maximum psychological impact for what was to come. A public killing was one thing. A public killing interrupted in front of a respected white journalist was a different kind of spectacle entirely. The stage was set at the Alhambra Bar and Theater on the corner of 126th and 7th Avenue. It was the beating heart of Harlem's cultural soul, a place where Duke Ellington's chords had once floated over the crowd and the scent of fine perfume mixed with cigarette smoke. On this Friday night, the air was thick with jazz and ambition, the low hum of 100 conversations creating a wall of sound. Bumpy arrived at 8 p.m., a portrait of sartorial perfection in a charcoal gray suit, a burgundy silk tie, and a fedora set at a precise angle. He looked like a banker, a philanthropist, anything but the most dangerous man in the borough. Helen was already seated, a vision in a blue dress and pearls. They ordered drinks. The conversation flowed easily from poetry to politics, a surreal bubble of civility. For a moment, the tension outside the velvet ropes seemed like a bad dream. But at 8:47 p.m. the dream shattered. The door to the Alhambra opened, and a chill cut through the warm, perfumed air. Ulysses Rollins walked in. He moved all wrong for the setting, shoulders back, head on a swivel, eyes scanning the room like twin spotlights. The music didn't stop, but it seemed to grow distant for those who noticed. Conversations at nearby tables stammered and died. He was a shark that had suddenly swum into a tranquil lagoon. His gaze swept past the musicians, past the laughing couples, and locked onto Bumpy Johnson, sitting calmly with his guest. A thin, cruel smile spread across Rollins's face. He had found his target. Helen Lawson felt the change before she saw it. The relaxed, charming intellectual beside her vanished. In his place sat a statue, every muscle coiled with a potential energy that suddenly made the air feel thin. "Bumpy," she asked, her voice barely a whisper, "is something wrong?" "No," he replied, his eyes never leaving the approaching figure. "Everything is proceeding. Excuse me for just a moment." Rollins made his way through the tables with a deliberate, theatrical slowness. This was his moment, the performance he was paid for. He wanted every eye on him. When he reached the table, he loomed over Bumpy, exploiting the physical advantage of standing over a seated man. The power dynamic, he believed, was clear. "You Bumpy Johnson." Rollins's voice was a gravelly boom, loud enough to silence the nearest tables. Bumpy looked up, his expression one of mild curiosity. "Depends on who's asking." "Dutch Schultz sends his regards, says you've been a problem, says problems need to be solved." Bumpy took a slow sip of his drink, the ice cubes clinking softly. "Tell Mr. Schultz that Harlem has already solved its problem with him. He just hasn't received the memo yet." The insult was calculated. Rollins's smirk faded. His hand, a massive slab of flesh and bone, drifted instinctively toward the inside of his jacket, toward the pistol grip. And in that millisecond, Bumpy Johnson made the only decision that could be made. In a room this packed, with Helen beside him, with waiters circulating, with musicians just feet away, a drawn gun meant chaos. Bullets have no conscience, no loyalty. Innocents would die. So Bumpy moved to keep the violence contained, intimate, and horrifically precise. What unfolded next was not a fight, it was a forensic dismantling. Bumpy's hand moved with the speed of a piston, not toward a hidden weapon, but to the right of his dinner plate. His fingers closed around the handle of his steak knife, a simple, serrated table utensil, now the most dangerous object in the room. Roland saw the movement and grunted, his own hand finally closing on his gun. But he was too late. Bumpy exploded upward from his chair, a coil of directed energy unleashed. The chair toppled backward. Helen gasped. The first cut was a blinding flash of silver. It wasn't a stab, but a deep, sweeping slash across Roland's forearm as he tried to clear his holster. The gun, half-drawn, clattered to the floor, lost under table. The second cut opened a red smile on Roland's cheek from ear to lip. By the third cut, a deep gash across the ribcage, Roland's brain was struggling to process the reality. He wasn't fighting a man, he was trying to grapple with a hurricane of sharpened steel. Bumpy was a smaller, but he was faster, a physicist of anatomy who understood leverage, angles, and weakness. They crashed into a neighboring table, sending glasses shattering and plates crashing to the floor in a cacophony of breaking crystal and screams. The band screeched to a halt. A wave of panic erupted as patrons scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the velvety walls, creating a macabre ring of spectators. But Helen Lawson, frozen in a strange journalistic trance, watched. She saw the man who had just debated the symbolism in Langston Hughes's poetry transform into an artist of visceral horror. Each movement was efficient, devoid of wasted rage. Cut 4, cut 5, cut 6. Roland swung a wild, powerful fist that Bumpy slipped easily, replying with a slash that tendon in the man's shoulder. This was mathematics. This was messaging. By the 12th cut, Roland's was bleeding from a dozen places, his white shirt now a crimson map of his failure. By the 18th, his movements were slow, labored. By cut 24, his legs buckled, and he fell to his knees on the food-strewn carpet, a beaten giant. The restaurant was silent save for Roland's ragged, wet breathing and the drip of blood from Bumpy's knife. And then, Bumpy delivered the coup de grace not to the man's life, but to his future as a threat. The blade, in a final, coldly practical motion, shot upward. It connected precisely above Ulysses Roland's left eye. The damage was immediate and absolute. The eyeball was permanently destroyed. A scream tore from Roland's throat, a raw, animal sound of utter agony that would live in the memory of everyone who heard it. Then in the ringing, breathless silence that followed that scream, Bumpy Johnson stood up. He looked down at the ruined, whimpering heap that was once Dutch Schultz's ultimate weapon. Blood, not his own, speckled his impeccable suit and hands, and he did the unimaginable. He reached up with his clean left hand and straightened his burgundy tie. The gesture was so mundane, so absurdly fastidious amidst the carnage, that it sent a deeper chill through the room than the violence itself. This was the core of the message. Absolute, unshakable composure. He then stepped over Roland's body, not around it. The act was a profound insult, treating the man as mere topography, an inconvenient puddle on his path. He walked back to his table, righted his overturned chair, and sat down. He looked across at Helen, her face a mask of ashen shock. "My apologies for the disruption," he said, his voice perfectly level, as if he'd just returned from a brief phone call. Then he raised a hand, catching the eye of a waiter who was trembling so violently he could barely stand. "Could we get some menus, please? I find I've worked up an appetite." The room remained in a state of suspended animation. No one moved, no one dared to. Bumpy, seeing the waiter was catatonic, simply reached to a nearby abandoned table, picked up a menu and perused it. He looked up at Helen, a ghost of his earlier charming smile touching his lips. "You know," he mused, his tone conversational, "I believe I'll have the spaghetti and meatballs." The order broke the spell, but only into a deeper, more bewildered silence. The spaghetti arrived, a large, steaming plate of pasta topped with rich red sauce. At the same time, the outside world intruded. Ambulance attendants rushed in, lifting the mutilated, barely conscious Roland's onto a stretcher. The flashing red lights from the street painted the scene in pulses of emergency, and in the center of it all, Bumpy Johnson lifted his fork. He twirled a modest bundle of pasta. He brought it to his mouth. He chewed slowly, deliberately. He took another bite. The sound of his fork on the plate was the only sound in the universe for those watching. Each motion was a syllable in a silent speech about power. Real power, he demonstrated, is not the capacity for violence, but the mastery over the chaos that follows it. It is the absolute sovereignty of self. He didn't just win a fight, he authored a legend with a fork, and every witness was a publisher. A morning the story had metastasized through Harlem, but the focus had subtly shifted. The 36 cuts were testament to Bumpy's prowess, yes, but the spaghetti was testament to his soul, or lack thereof. It was the detail that elevated him from a dangerous man to a mythic figure. Did you hear he ate? The story reached Dutch Schultz in his Bronx fortress by noon. His lieutenant delivered the report, face pale. Boss, Rollins failed. Johnson cut him to pieces, took his eye. And then he sat down and ate his dinner. Schultz, a volcano of a man, did not erupt. He grew very, very quiet. He put down his cigar. Is he dead? No, but he's finished. Schultz walked to the window, staring out at a city he thought he owned. The financial loss was one thing, the humiliation was another, but what he was processing was something more fundamental, a tactical revelation. We keep thinking we can intimidate them, he said softly, almost to himself. We send in bigger, meaner animals and they just produce someone like this. He turned to his stunned lieutenant. We leave Harlem alone. The order was unthinkable, a total strategic retreat. Call Lucky Luciano. Tell him we need to arrange a sit-down, not with me, with him, with Bumpy Johnson. 6 months later, Dutch Schultz would be dead, assassinated in a Newark restaurant on the orders of the very national crime syndicate he'd helped create. His demise cleared the way for a new order, and Bumpy Johnson, the man from Harlem, would indeed sit down at the table with figures like Lucky Luciano. He negotiated not as a subordinate, but as a sovereign power, securing a fragile peace that recognized Harlem as his domain. He became the godfather of his community, a protector who would rule for 3 more decades, mentor a young Frank Lucas, and become an indelible part of American folklore. But on that hot summer night in 1935, he was just a man in a blood-spattered suit, proving a point that would become etched in history. The legend of the spaghetti dinner was born not from the violence, but from the profound, chilling calm that followed it, a calm so complete it forced the most powerful criminal empire in the world to stop, reconsider, and finally to back down. In Harlem, respect wasn't requested. It was carved, one deliberate cut at a time, and then politely enjoyed with a side of pasta.